All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session. We are going to be talking about digital accessibility, specifically for student-facing projects that you're going to be, asking your students to do in your course this year. My name is Rachel Krieger. I am one of the instructional consultants with LSA Technology Services. A couple of things before we do get started today. Logistic wise, I am recording today's session and I will be sending out the recording along with the slides after we are finished for today. There are automated captions available. If you go down to your bottom toolbar and select show captions, those will be available for you. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in chat. I do have a couple of colleagues joining us today who are going to help kind of moderate that. But of course, I am hoping to save some time at the end for some Q&A. So we'll circle back to some of your questions, or if you prefer to unmute and ask those at the end, that is totally fine as well. All right, so why accessibility matters? Why is it important? So I want you to think about the role that information technology plays in your daily life. So anytime really that you are consuming content online, so that could be looking at email messages. It could be a lot of times we get a lot of newsletters, articles that come into our inbox that we're reading. It could be that we're going online to purchase something on a website. Maybe you are scrolling and viewing things on social media. Perhaps maybe you are planning a trip. So you're doing some research, you're going to various websites. Maybe you're going to a restaurant and you want to view the menu ahead of time. That is all content, information technology that you would access online on a device. So now imagine that something about how that information is presented online keeps you from accessing it. And that is really often the reality for people with disabilities when they use websites or apps or other digital media. Um, However, if we are very deliberate about the way that we create our content, we can help to remove a lot of those barriers that are preventing people from accessing the content, tools, and services so that everyone is able to use them. And that's really what makes our content out on the web accessible. So I'd also like to touch on the principles of universal design. And universal design for learning, UDL, is really the idea that all of the content that you're creating for your course should be available to all of your students. And for that to happen, it needs to be presented in multiple formats so that everyone is able to engage in the content. Let's see. When we are creating materials, we do have to be aware that a wide variety of people may be consuming that material. When we put stuff out on the web, we don't know when it's being put out there for public consumption. We don't know who's accessing it. It could be people with a disability who are unable to see or unable to hear, but it could also be people who are in different environments. We don't know if they're accessing our content in a very noisy environment or a very quiet environment where maybe they cannot, hear or listen to the audio that is playing. And so they need a text alternative that they're able to read. Maybe they are, have difficulty reading very small text on the screen. And so they need to be able to zoom in and enlarge the text in order to read it. Maybe they need the text read by a screen reader. Or maybe they're colorblind and they're not able to differentiate between various colors on our website or on our content. Or again, maybe they are not able to view very high or low contrast colors, which again would make it very difficult and create a barrier for them in order to access and consume the content that we're producing. So I have included some accessibility guidelines and policies that have been put in place. The first one here, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the WCAG. So this has been put in place, and this really is what informs us and helps guide us in the different guidelines and policies that we are creating and enforcing. And they align with U of M's Electronic and Information Technology Accessibility Policy that has been in place for the last several years. So I do encourage you to click on those at some point so that you are able to get a better idea of what those are. So by following, these best practices and standards for accessibility, we are able to create a more inclusive and equitable environment for everyone online. And so far, this is the third session in kind of our accessibility series that we have put on. And the last two workshops, if you were able to attend those, were about accessibility for text documents and then accessibility for images and videos. And we really dove deeper into what those guidelines are for each of those, and tips, tricks, do's, don'ts on how to actually apply those guidelines. And they were really focused on the content that we as instructors are creating and putting out there for our students in our classes. So today I kind of want to shift that and think about how can we apply and how can we encourage our students to be thinking about these same accessibility guidelines when they are producing work for class. A lot more instructors are asking their students to create projects and then put them out on the web for public consumption. And when we do that, when we ask our students to do that, we also need to make them aware that accessibility is something to keep in mind, something that we constantly need to be thinking about and applying as a best practice to creating web content. So what types of student projects might this apply to? So really, this is going to be any project or assignment that you are asking your students to put out on the web that's public facing for public consumption. So that could be a website, it could be a class blog, really any digital content. If you're asking them to create a post and post it on a social media site, create a digital story like a story map. Any of that is going to be available for anyone to come across on the web and view. I know I've worked with quite a few instructors who their goal at the end of that project was actually to create a resource that would be available for like K-12 students to use to be able to kind of research and learn more about the topic that the students were creating. So if our intention is to kind of create a resource for other people to consume, we have to make sure that it's accessible. This could also apply to, videos, podcasts, audio-visual essays, posters, flyers, again, anything that you are creating and posting on the web. Now, right now, students and faculty only need to focus on accessibility for those public-facing projects. So thinking about if you are having students create a project and they're only submitting it to you as the instructor, maybe they're submitting it via email or submitting it through a Canvas assignment, and the only people who are seeing that are the student and the instructor, then these accessibility accommodations aren't as important. It doesn't mean that they're not important at all, but they're not as important because we know that we know exactly who the person is that's going to be consuming that content, and hopefully we would be able to know or ask them if they need some sort of accessibility accommodation. The same thing applies to any content that's going to be within the shell of your course. So if it's only being submitted on Canvas and viewable by the students in that class, it's not as important because, again, we have a better idea of who our audience is and what accommodation needs they might have for that content. Now, of course, you may have students in your class who do have accommodations or who would benefit from these accessibility guidelines. But right now, our focus is that public consumption. It is always good to be talking about the value and the importance of accessibility and keeping that in mind and getting students in the habit of always being mindful of accessibility when they're creating work, no matter who it's for, even if it's just for their instructor, even if it's just for their peers within their class. It's always good to keep that in mind and to build that habit, because that's going to be very, very beneficial for them as they, graduate and go off into careers where they might need to apply those accessibility guidelines. But definitely, if you're needing to start small, definitely start with just those public facing projects that you are asking students to complete. So I'm going to take a brief minute here to kind of talk through what some of these kind of core accessibility guidelines are. I'm not going to go too deep into these guidelines because, again, we just did 2 sessions talking about just text accessibility, and then a second session about video and images. If you were unable to attend those 2 sessions, I would be happy to send you the recording. Please reach out to me and I can send you the recording to those 2 sessions so you can get more information on how to actually apply these different guidelines. The first one is page hierarchy. So this really applies to page, document, text content. So if you are, let's say, having your students create a web page or a blog where it's going to be text heavy, those pages need to incorporate some page hierarchy and structure. And you can do that by using headings and built-in styles in whatever web builder you're using or word processor using, whether it's Google Docs, Microsoft Word, the WordPress, editor. There's going to be built-in styles and headings that you can select. So you want to make sure that you are selecting the correct title heading and then using the headings to create structure. And again, in order to kind of go deeper into that concept, I will send resources and I can send you the recordings to the previous sessions. And then, of course, your list, formatting your lists properly, rather than hand numbering, a numbered list or a bulleted list, actually using that little button in the rich text editor for a bulleted list or a numbered list. That is going to really help for screen readers and for people to navigate the page content. Another guideline to keep in mind is color contrast. So making sure that you are choosing colors that are going to have the appropriate color contrast ratio, which is going to make it a lot easier for people to view that content. So making sure that you're using a light colored text on a dark background and vice versa, a dark colored text on a light colored background. So I did link there for you a color contrast checker that's really helpful. And you can share that with your students as well. And then also making sure that you're not using color alone to convey information. So this comes out a lot when we create graphics. Maybe we have a graph and that graph is showing information. And so maybe I use red, green, and yellow to show the different labels on that graph. But someone who is unable to differentiate between those colors needs some other way in order to understand what that graph is saying. So you always want to have kind of some alternative to colors that you're using when conveying information. The next one is typography. So this is going to be specific to your types of fonts. And so making sure that you are using sans serif fonts. And I gave some examples there of some popular sans serif fonts as your body text. So those, longer areas of text, your paragraphs, those are going to increase the readability. And then save those serif fonts. Those are typically your little fancier fonts. They have, little serifs at the end of the letters. Again, I included some examples there. Save those for your titles or your headers where you have much shorter, larger areas of text, and that's going to make it much easier for people to read. And then descriptive link text. So this one deals with the links that we are putting, and a lot of the content that we put out online, we're linking, right, to outside resources, other websites, other documents, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're always providing information about where that link is going to take us. What's the purpose of that? So we want to avoid saying click here and just linking the click here or read more. Because someone who's reading a screen reader or using a screen reader to access that information, all they're going to hear is click here or read more. And they're not going to have any idea of where that click here is going to take them. And so we want to be very descriptive of where that information is taking us. All right, and then the last two, so these deal with more of your multimedia types of content, your images, your audio, your video files that you're creating. And so anytime you have an image or a graphic, you want to make sure that you are providing alternative text, that alt text. And this should be provided for all images and all graphics that you have. And it's intended to serve as kind of a visual description describing the image or the graphic. Someone who's unable to view that image or graphic, there's some sort of text alternative that's going to allow them to know, what that image or that graphic is showing. A lot of times, if you're just using a decorative image, maybe that image or that graphic is not providing any content or information that is important or relevant, then you can, normally there's a little checkbox and you can designate that as just a decorative image. So that someone using a screen reader knows, I don't need to, pay attention to that image. It's not going to take away from the content. And then finally, the last one is captions and transcripts. And so anytime you have audio, so especially I'm thinking like podcast assignments have been very popular lately. So text transcripts should be provided for all audio. And then any video that consists of, mainly a speaker talking for the majority of the time, that is, should have a transcript as well. And then captioning and video descriptions should be provided for all video content. Captioning, that is really going to be for the speaking, the sound that is going along with the video, so that people who are unable to hear or see that are able to read it. And then the video descriptions are really going to provide descriptions for things that are happening in the video, but that may not be spoken words. So maybe there's a sigh, or maybe, there is some background noise or music or something happening that is beneficial or important to know that maybe is not spoken words. And so that would be included in the video description. So those are kind of the main core guidelines that you want to be thinking about, encouraging your students to use and to be thinking about as they're creating their projects. But how do we actually kind of incorporate this, into those assignments into our class? So the first thing would be to communicate, why accessibility is important, why it's, number one, important just overall for everyone, right? It creates that inclusive and equitable online environment for people who are reading it. But it's also going to be beneficial and important for the students themselves, right? You have to create some value so that the students, feel like this is going to help them in some way. It's a transferable skill that they're going to be able to use as they move to various careers, a lot of fields. It is going to be important that they have those skills, and they're going to need those to complete a lot of jobs in the future. And then teach the guidelines that align with the type of project that you're asking the students to complete. So of course, I know the content that you're teaching in your course, may not have anything to do with accessibility, and you don't necessarily want to, take an entire class period to teach accessibility guidelines. So you don't necessarily have to teach every single one of these guidelines. That's not necessarily your responsibility. So choose the guidelines that do align with the type of project you're asking them to complete. If you're asking them to complete a podcast project, well, then a lot of the first guidelines aren't necessarily going to apply to that project. They're not going to have to worry about page structure. They're not going to have to worry about color contrast and typography. But being that it's an audio file, it's going to be important that they have a text transcript that goes along with that podcast. And so showing examples, a lot of times instructors will share examples if they're having their students create some sort of multimedia project, examples that you've created or examples from past classes. Make sure that the examples that you're showing your students are accessible. If you're showing them an example of a podcast, make sure it has a text, transcript to go along with it so they can see that actually in practice. And you can even talk about, things that they come across just in their everyday lives. My bet is that the majority of your students have listened to a podcast at some point. And when you go on and listen to a podcast on your phone, there is the option to view a transcript. And so just encouraging them and teaching them that they need to incorporate that when creating those types of projects. And then including these accessibility guidelines as part of your assignment description and your expectations. So right there on the project sheet that has the directions, your expectations, how they're going to be graded, make sure to include that in that description so that they are, aware that that's something that they have to do and that you're expecting of them. That could also be a place where you are providing some additional resources or information on how to actually create a transcript, if that, going with that podcast example. And then determining how you're going to grade. So thinking about grading, I think it all depends on the content of your course and whether accessibility is actually a learning goal that you want students to have, or whether it's just, something that you want them to be mindful of and in encouraging them to complete. So whatever you decide, whether it's just going to be kind of a good faith effort, you've created that transcript, you've included it with your project, I'm going to give you a point for doing that on your project? Or are you actually going to say, no, I'm going to grade you on the accuracy of that transcript, if that's something that you want to take on or that you think is valuable or important for the context of your course, then you would want to include that in the project description. Um, I think either way is fine. I think at this point, we just need to get our students to be thinking about accessibility, to be mindful of it. And so, to have to grade 100 podcasts and for the accuracy of their transcripts is going to add a lot of work for you and for people who are grading. So I think to start with, kind of that good faith effort is acceptable because you are getting them thinking about the accessibility standards. You're, encouraging them to incorporate that in creating the content that they're producing online. And so, I think that that's okay. But making that clear to your students ahead of time in the assignment, I think, is important of how they're going to be graded on these various accessibility guidelines that you're requiring. So I do have a bunch of additional resources for you to dive deeper into these various guidelines. So there is a 10-week accessibility challenge that is coming up. It's going to be run during fall semester and during winter semester. And basically what it is just an email that you're going to get every week about a different topic with accessibility, information, tips, resources, tricks. There is a little task that you could choose. It's optional, choose to complete. But just getting that in your inbox once a week is helpful. And, I did it over the summer and I just tagged them all with digital accessibility. And I refer back to those very frequently if I'm needing some information. So consider signing up for that. And then I've outlined a lot of resources for you for the different guidelines. So we have just kind of general accessibility of why it's important, understanding it. The WebAIM website there, that is a really comprehensive resource, and that is the one that I go back to most consistently. So that WebAIM website there is going to be really helpful for you and your students. And then page hierarchy, I have some additional resources for color contrast, descriptive text, alt text, video recordings, audio recordings, etc. And then, of course, because you are creating assignments for your students, I am happy to sit down with you and kind of think through the particular assignment that you are creating and asking your students to do. And we can sit down and think about what accessibility guidelines do align with this project. What should we be asking your students to do? What types of resources are there for them? How do you go about teaching that in your class? Myself and the other instructional learning consultants in my office are happy to sit down and think that through with you. So please get in touch with us and we can schedule a consultation. So I'm going to stop sharing for now. And if there are any questions that you have, please feel free. You can unmute and ask those. I'll take a look in chat to see if there were any questions that needed to still be answered.